The atmosphere of the world known as Parnassia did not taste of copper or the scorched ozone of dying empires, but of crushed mint and the heavy, sweet humidity of a greenhouse in perpetual bloom. Analyst Sunder walked through the transit corridors of the primary meridian, a structure composed of translucent ceramic that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent amber glow. The floor beneath Sunder's feet was slightly yielding, a composite material designed to harvest the kinetic energy of every footfall and recycle it back into the city's life support systems. There was no sound of machinery here, only the rhythmic thrum of the subterranean irrigation veins that carried nutrient-rich fluids to the hanging gardens draping every skyscraper. Sunder checked the data slate embedded in their forearm, watching the cascading streams of green light that indicated the health of the planetary crust. For 3 centuries, the Accord of Unified Systems had maintained this equilibrium, turning a once barren rock into a self-sustaining Eden where the concept of scarcity had been relegated to the archives of ancient history. The mission for the day was simple yet profound: to recalibrate the atmospheric scrubbers in the southern hemisphere to allow for a slightly higher concentration of floral pollens, facilitating the migration of the nectar birds that had recently been reintroduced to the ecosystem. Sunder reached the central hub of the meridian, a vast open space where the ceiling opened to a sky of shimmering violet. Giant, slow-moving sails of gossamer fabric drifted through the upper atmosphere, catching the solar winds to regulate the planet's temperature. There were no vehicles in the traditional sense. Instead, people moved through the air on gentle currents generated by localized gravity wells, drifting like dandelion seeds toward their respective destinations. Sunder watched a group of students practicing their horticultural weaves, using small, handheld emitters to encourage the growth of crystalline vines along the support pillars of the hub. The vines responded to the frequency of the emitters, twisting and spiraling in patterns that were both aesthetically pleasing and structurally reinforcing. It was a world of intentional beauty, where every action was calculated to enhance the collective well-being of both the inhabitants and the environment. Sunder felt a deep sense of pride in this work, knowing that the struggles of their ancestors had paved the way for this era of unprecedented harmony. The old stories of war and resource depletion seemed like ghost tales told to remind them of why the Accord's laws were so vital. As Sunder approached the main terminal, a colleague named Vespera stepped out from behind a curtain of weeping willow moss. Vespera was a senior biotic, responsible for the genetic diversity of the equatorial forests. Her eyes were a bright, artificial teal, a common modification for those who spent their days analyzing the microstructures of plant cells. Vespera greeted Sunder with a brief touch of palms, a gesture of shared purpose. She explained that the latest readings from the southern scrubbers were showing an unexpected surge in oxygen production, suggesting that the newly planted ironwood groves were maturing faster than the models had predicted. This was excellent news, as it meant the planet could support an even denser population of oxygen-breathing fauna in the coming decades. Sunder and Vespera spent the next hour reviewing the growth charts, their fingers dancing over the holographic interfaces that floated in the air between them. The data was a symphony of positive indicators. Soil acidity was stabilizing, the water tables were replenishing at a steady rate, and the local weather patterns were becoming increasingly predictable. It was a testament to the success of the Verdant Algorithm, the massive artificial intelligence that managed the planet's delicate biological balance. The conversation eventually turned to the upcoming centennial celebration of the Accord. It was to be a festival of light and growth, where every citizen would plant a new species of flora developed in the communal labs. Vespera spoke with excitement about a particular strain of bioluminescent lily she had been working on, which would change color based on the emotional state of the people nearby. Sunder found the idea fascinating, noting that such a project could provide valuable data on the social cohesion of the meridian sectors. They discussed the technical requirements for the lilies, calculating the necessary nitrogen levels and the specific light spectrum required for the flowers to thrive. There was no competition in their dialogue, only a shared desire to see the project succeed. On Parnassia, the success of one was the success of all, and the pursuit of knowledge was considered the highest form of contribution to society. Sunder felt a warm glow of satisfaction as they finalized the calibration settings for the scrubbers. The task was done, but the work of nurturing the world was never truly finished. It was a continuous cycle of care and observation, a commitment to a future that remained bright and full of potential. After parting ways with Vespera, Sunder decided to take the long route back to their living quarters, walking through the arboretum that served as the heart of the city. The air here was even thicker with the scent of blooming things, and the sound of falling water echoed softly from the many tiered fountains. Each fountain was a work of art, carved from recycled ship hulls and integrated with mosses that filtered the water as it tumbled down. Sunder stopped to watch a pair of small mammalian creatures, long-eared gliders that had been engineered for the low-gravity environment, leap between the branches of a massive baobab tree. The creatures were playful and unafraid, a sign that the rewilding efforts were succeeding. Sunder reached out a hand, and one of the gliders paused, sniffing the air before continuing its frantic game of tag. In this moment, the vastness of the galaxy felt small and manageable, contained within the emerald walls of this sanctuary. The challenges of the past were gone, and the challenges of the future were merely puzzles waiting to be solved by curious minds. Sunder continued their walk, their footsteps light on the soft, living earth, a tiny part of a grand and beautiful design that spanned the stars. The evening light on Parnassia shifted from violet to a deep, translucent indigo, signaling the time for the city's lights to dim and the natural bioluminescence to take over. Sunder reached the residential spire, a spiraling tower of glass and vine that seemed to grow directly out of the bedrock. Their apartment was a modest space, filled with books, botanical samples, and a large window that looked out over the glowing canopy of the forest below. Sunder sat by the window, watching the lights of the other spires flicker on like distant stars. The world was quiet, but it was a vibrant, living quiet, the sound of a planet breathing in its sleep. Sunder opened their personal log and began to record the day's findings, noting the success of the scrubber calibration and the promising growth of the ironwood groves. They felt a profound sense of peace, a certainty that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. The Verdant Algorithm was humming in the background of the planetary network, a silent guardian ensuring that the dream of Parnassia would continue for generations to come. Sunder closed their eyes, letting the scent of the mint and the sweet humidity carry them into a restful, dreamless sleep, ready to face another day of growth and discovery. By the time the first light of the twin suns began to filter through the canopy the next morning, Sunder was already awake and reviewing the overnight telemetry. The Southern Hemisphere's scrubbers had responded perfectly to the new settings, and the pollen counts were already beginning to rise in accordance with the migration patterns of the nectar birds. Sunder noticed a small anomaly in the water pressure of the third sector, but a quick check revealed it was merely a scheduled flush of the filtration membranes. Everything was functioning within the optimal parameters. Sunder prepared a simple meal of nutrient-dense fruits and a warm herbal infusion, eating slowly while watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the planet never grew old. It was a constant source of inspiration and a reminder of the fragility of the balance they maintained. Today, Sunder was scheduled to meet with the Council of Architects to discuss the expansion of the northern reefs. It was an ambitious project that involved the creation of new coral-like structures designed to process oceanic minerals into usable construction materials. The Council of Architects met in a chamber at the very top of the primary meridian, a room with walls made entirely of reinforced diamond glass. From this vantage point, one could see the entire sprawl of the city and the vast, verdant wilderness that lay beyond its borders. The council members were a diverse group of humans and synthetic intelligences, all working together to guide the physical evolution of the colony. Sunder presented the data on the mineral concentrations in the northern currents, showing that the conditions were ideal for the introduction of the biocrystalline reefs. The architects listened intently, asking questions about the long-term impact on the marine food chains and the structural integrity of the harvested materials. Sunder answered with confidence, backed by the simulations provided by the Verdant Algorithm. The discussion was rigorous but collaborative, a hallmark of the Accord's decision-making process. There were no ego-driven conflicts, only a shared commitment to the most sustainable and beneficial path forward. By the end of the session, the project was approved, and Sunder was tasked with overseeing the initial seeding phase. Leaving the council chamber, Sunder felt a surge of adrenaline. The reef project was a significant step forward in their goal of making the colony entirely self-sufficient in terms of building materials. It would reduce the need for orbital mining and further integrate the city's infrastructure with the planet's natural cycles. As they descended the spire, Sunder sent a message to Vespera, inviting her to collaborate on the marine life integration for the reefs. Vespera replied almost instantly with an enthusiastic confirmation, already suggesting a list of symbiotic seagrasses that could be used to stabilize the seabed around the new structures. The synergy between the different departments was the engine that drove Parnassia's progress, a testament to the power of a unified vision. Sunder spent the rest of the afternoon in the labs, preparing the first batches of crystalline spores. The work was delicate, requiring precise control over the temperature and chemical composition of the growth medium. Each spore was a tiny miracle of bioengineering, programmed to grow into a specific geometric shape that would provide maximum surface area for mineral absorption. As the suns began their descent once more, Sunder looked out over the city, seeing it not just as a collection of buildings and people, but as a single, massive organism. Every person, every plant, and every machine was a cell in this body, working in concert to sustain the whole. The optimism that defined their society was not a blind faith, but a rational conclusion based on centuries of successful stewardship. They had proved that it was possible to live in harmony with a planet, to take only what was needed, and to give back more than was taken. The Verdant Algorithm was the brain that coordinated these efforts, but the heart was the collective will of the people of Parnassia. Sunder felt a deep connection to this world, a sense of belonging that transcended their individual existence. They were a part of something grand, something that would endure long after their own time had passed. With the crystalline spores safely stored for the next day's journey to the northern coast, Sunder stepped out onto the balcony of the lab, breathing in the cool, evening air. The future was a vast, open horizon, and they were ready to meet it with open arms and a curious mind. The journey of Parnassia was just beginning, and every day was a new chapter in a story of growth, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. The transit to the northern coast was an opportunity for Sunder to see the transition between the urban centers and the deep wilderness. They traveled by a low-impact maglev shuttle that skimmed just above the treetops, providing a panoramic view of the diverse biomes that made up the planet's surface. Below, the dense rainforest gave way to sprawling grasslands where herds of synthetic biological grazers roamed, their metallic hides glinting in the sunlight. These creatures were designed to manage the grass height and distribute seeds, acting as mobile gardeners for the vast plains. Sunder watched as a group of young grazers skipped through a patch of wildflowers, their movements fluid and natural despite their artificial origins. The shuttle moved silently, its magnetic fields causing only a slight ripple in the leaves of the trees it passed. Sunder used the travel time to refine the deployment map for the crystalline spores, ensuring that the initial reef clusters would be placed in areas with the highest mineral density and the most stable currents. Upon reaching the coast, Sunder was met by the local maritime team, a group of specialists who lived in floating habitats anchored just offshore. These habitats were themselves marvels of engineering, designed to rise and fall with the tides and withstand even the most powerful oceanic storms. The team leader, a robust man with skin weathered by the sun and salt named Marlowe, welcomed Sunder with a hearty grin. Marlowe had spent his entire life on the water, and his knowledge of the northern currents was unparalleled. He took Sunder out to the seeding site on a small, solar-powered skiff, the water beneath them so clear that the sandy bottom was visible even at great depths. Marlowe pointed out the schools of native fish that had begun to return to the area since the water purification project had been completed. The ocean was teeming with life, a vibrant blue contrast to the emerald green of the land. Sunder felt a sense of awe at the scale of the restoration effort. What had once been an acidic, lifeless sea was now a thriving ecosystem, thanks to the persistent efforts of the Accord. The process of seeding the reefs was a meticulous task. Sunder and Marlowe used a specialized deployment tube to release the crystalline spores at precise intervals along the seabed. As the spores touched the water, they began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light, reacting to the minerals in the ocean. Within minutes, the first tiny structures began to form, thin filaments of crystal reaching out to grip the rocks and sand. It would take months for the reefs to reach their full size, but the initial results were promising. Sunder monitored the growth rates on their slate, seeing the data points align perfectly with the projected models. Marlowe watched the process with a look of quiet satisfaction, noting that the new reefs would provide much-needed shelter for the local crustacean populations. The integration of artificial and natural systems was seamless, a hallmark of Parnassian philosophy. They were not replacing nature, but enhancing it, providing the scaffolding upon which life could flourish more effectively. As the sun began to set over the ocean, painting the waves in shades of orange and pink, Sunder and Marlowe returned to the floating habitat. The evening was spent in the company of the maritime team, sharing a meal of lab-grown seafood and fresh vegetables from the habitat's hydroponic gardens. The conversation was lively, filled with stories of the sea and discussions about the future of the reef project. Sunder found themselves drawn to the simple, purposeful lives of the maritime workers who lived in such close proximity to the elements they sought to protect. There was a profound sense of camaraderie here, a feeling of being part of a small but essential team working toward a common goal. Sunder realized that while the primary meridian was the brain of the colony, places like this were its hands and feet, doing the direct work of environmental stewardship. They felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to ensuring that the reef project would succeed not just for the benefit of the city, but for the health of the entire planetary ocean. The next few days were spent monitoring the initial growth of the reefs and adjusting the nutrient flow to ensure the spores had everything they needed to thrive. Sunder worked closely with Marlowe and his team, learning the nuances of the northern currents and the behavior of the local marine life. They discovered that a particular species of small, iridescent fish was attracted to the glow of the crystalline spores, and their presence actually accelerated the mineral absorption process by stirring up the sediment on the seafloor. This was an unexpected but welcome development, a perfect example of the emergent synergies that often occurred when artificial systems were introduced into a healthy ecosystem. Sunder meticulously documented these findings, knowing they would be invaluable for future reef projects in other parts of the world. The Verdant Algorithm would incorporate this new data, refining its models and becoming even more efficient at predicting the complex interactions of the planetary biosphere. On the final day of their stay at the northern coast, Sunder took a moment to swim in the clear, warm waters above the new reef site. Looking down through a diving mask, they could see the crystalline filaments spreading across the seabed like a web of light. The small, iridescent fish darted in and out of the growing structures, their scales flashing in the sunlight that filtered down from above. It was a scene of incredible beauty and peace, a glimpse into a future where the line between the natural and the artificial was gracefully blurred. Sunder felt a profound sense of gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to this work, to be a part of the ongoing story of Parnassia's growth. They knew that there would be challenges ahead, but they also knew that they had the tools, the knowledge, and the collective will to overcome them. The optimism of their society was not a static state, but a dynamic force, a constant striving toward a better, more harmonious world. As the shuttle carried them back toward the primary meridian, Sunder looked out over the landscape with new eyes. They saw the intricate connections between the forests, the grasslands, and the oceans, all held together by the careful management of the Accord. The Reef Project was just one small part of a much larger effort, a single thread in a vast and beautiful tapestry. Sunder felt a deep sense of connection to the planet and to the people who shared it with them. They were all gardeners, in one way or another, tending to the world and to each other. The journey back was a time for reflection, for processing the experiences of the past few days and preparing for the tasks that lay ahead. The primary meridian appeared on the horizon, its spires glowing in the afternoon light, a beacon of hope and progress in a galaxy that was slowly awakening to the possibilities of a sustainable future. Back in the city, Sunder was greeted by Vespera, who was eager to hear about the progress of the Reef Project. They spent several hours in the central hub, reviewing the data and discussing the next steps for the marine integration. Vespera had already begun the process of selecting the symbiotic seagrasses, and she was excited about the possibility of using the iridescent fish as a natural catalyst for growth. The two of them worked together with a seamless efficiency, their ideas flowing back and forth like the currents of the Northern Sea. It was a reminder of why Sunder loved their work, the constant opportunity for collaboration, the shared passion for discovery, and the tangible impact of their efforts on the world around them. They were not just building a city, they were nurturing a planet, and every small success was a victory for all of life on Parnassia. As the week came to a close, Sunder took some time to visit the Arboretum once more. The nectar birds had begun their migration, and the air was filled with their melodic calls and the flash of their colorful plumage. The southern scrubbers were working perfectly, and the fragrance of the blooming flowers was even more intense than before. Sunder sat on a bench beneath a massive willow moss tree, watching the birds flit among the blossoms. The world was in balance, and for a moment everything felt perfect. But Sunder knew that balance was not a destination, but a process. It required constant attention, constant care, and a constant willingness to learn and adapt. They were ready for whatever the future might bring, confident in the strength of their community and the wisdom of the Verdant Algorithm. The story of Parnassia was a story of hope, and Sunder was proud to be one of its authors. The final entry in Sunder's log for the week was a simple one, a reflection on the beauty of the world and the importance of their collective mission. They wrote about the crystalline reefs, the iridescent fish, and the scent of the mint in the evening air. They wrote about the shared goals and the collaborative spirit that define their society. And they wrote about the future, a future that was as bright and vibrant as the world they were building together. As Sunder closed their slate and looked out over the glowing city, they felt a profound sense of peace. The Verdant Algorithm continued its silent work, the forests continued to grow, and the people of Parnassia continued to dream. It was a good time to be alive, and an even better time to be a gardener of the stars. The first chapter of their new project was complete, but the book of their world was far from finished, and each new page was a promise of a better tomorrow. The transition from the coastal deployment back to the rhythmic pulse of the primary meridian felt like moving from a wild, salt-sprayed dream into a structured, emerald reality. Analyst Sunder did not allow the inertia of travel to dull the sharp focus required for the next phase of the planetary integration. The data from the northern reefs was already being ingested by the central nodes of the Verdant Algorithm, and the preliminary simulations suggested that the mineral processing capacity of the new structures would exceed the initial projections by nearly 15%. This surplus opened a window of opportunity that the Council of Architects was eager to exploit. Sunder was summoned to the high-altitude laboratories of the Atmospheric Division, a cluster of silvered spheres suspended by carbon nanotube tethers above the cloud layer. Here the air was thin and crisp, smelling of nothing but purity and the faint, metallic tang of the electrostatic shields. Sunder met with a specialist named Orin, whose expertise lay in the manipulation of high-altitude aerosols and the seeding of rain fronts. Orin was a man of quiet intensity, his movements precise and economical, reflecting a lifetime spent calibrating the very breath of the planet. Orin gestured toward a sprawling holographic projection that filled the center of the lab, a real-time map of Parnassia's weather systems. He explained that with the increased oxygen and mineral output from the new reefs, they could now afford to intensify the moisture cycles in the arid rain shadow of the Great Spine, a mountain range that had remained stubbornly dry for decades. The goal was to initiate a controlled terraforming pulse that would transform the dust plains into a sprawling savanna, providing a new corridor for the terrestrial migration of the larger herbivore species. Sunder looked at the shimmering patterns of wind and pressure, seeing the elegance of the plan. It was not merely about adding water. It was about choreographing a continental-scale transformation that required the synchronization of the ocean's temperature, the mountain's thermal currents, and the biological respiration of the existing forests. Orin's proposal involved the deployment of specialized condensation nuclei, microscopic, organic particles that would encourage the formation of heavy, nutrient-rich clouds over the parched lowlands. The technical challenges were significant, as the Great Spine acted as a formidable barrier to the humid air flowing from the coast. Sunder and Orin spent hours refining the chemical composition of the nuclei, ensuring they would be biodegradable and provide a boost to the dormant seeds buried in the dust plain soil. They worked in a state of flow, their conversation a rapid-fire exchange of atmospheric constants and biological variables. There was a profound sense of mutual respect in their collaboration, a shared understanding that they were playing a part in a much larger story of planetary healing. Sunder suggested integrating a specific trace element into the nuclei that would react with the sunlight to create a mild refractive effect, protecting the young sprouts from the intense midday heat of the twin suns. Orin agreed, noting that this adjustment would also create a shimmering, opalescent quality in the rain, a visual marker of the Accord's intervention that would be visible for hundreds of miles. As they finalized the parameters for the first seeding run, Sunder felt a familiar sense of anticipation. Every time they touched the planet's systems, there was a risk of unforeseen consequences, but the Verdant algorithm provided a safety net of probabilistic modeling that made the risk manageable. They were not imposing their will on the world, but rather guiding its natural tendencies toward a state of higher complexity and abundance. The Savannah Project was a bold step, one that would require the cooperation of several other divisions, including the Soil Enrichment Team and the Faunal Reintroduction Bureau. Sunder took on the responsibility of coordinating these efforts, knowing that the success of the rain front depended on the readiness of the ground to receive it. They sent out a series of encrypted data packets to the relevant heads of department, outlining the timeline and the expected ecological shifts. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. The promise of a new biome was a powerful motivator for a society dedicated to the expansion of life. The following morning, Sunder joined Orin on an atmospheric cruiser, a sleek, wide-winged vessel designed to cruise the upper limits of the troposphere. The cruiser was loaded with canisters of the condensation nuclei, each one a pressurized vessel of potential life. As they soared over the great spine, Sunder looked down at the rugged peaks, their jagged edges softened by the thin veils of cloud that clung to the summits. Beyond the mountains lay the dust plains, a vast expanse of ochre and rust-colored earth that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a stark contrast to the lush greenery of the primary meridian, a reminder of what much of Parnassia had looked like before the Accord arrived. Sunder felt a surge of determination. This was the work they were born for, the turning of desolation into a garden. Orin took the controls, bringing the cruiser into a wide, sweeping arc that followed the curve of the mountain range. At the optimal moment, the deployment hatches opened, and a fine, shimmering mist began to trail behind the vessel, caught in the downdrafts that swept toward the plains. The effect was not instantaneous, but as the cruiser made its second pass, Sunder could see the first signs of the atmospheric reaction. The air behind them began to thicken and darken, the clear blue of the sky giving way to a deep, bruised purple as the moisture began to coalesce around the organic nuclei. The sensors on the cruiser's hull began to pick up the first drops of rain, a gentle pattering that sounded like a million tiny heartbeats against the ceramic skin of the vessel. Below them, the dust began to darken as the water struck the parched earth, the first rain these plains had seen in a generation. Sunder watched the readouts with bated breath, seeing the humidity levels spike and the temperature begin to drop. The Verdant algorithm confirmed that the front was stabilizing, moving exactly as predicted toward the heart of the rain shadow. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, a testament to the power of human ingenuity when aligned with the natural world. Over the next several days, Sunder remained in the high-altitude labs, monitoring the progress of the Savannah pulse. The rains continued, falling in steady, nourishing cycles that allowed the water to soak deep into the soil without causing erosion. The dormant seeds, some of which had survived for centuries in the dry earth, began to stir. Tiny shoots of gold grass and emerald clover began to poke through the surface, turning the ochre plains into a mosaic of emerging life. Sunder worked with the Soil Enrichment Team to deploy a second wave of microbial boosters via smaller autonomous drones, ensuring that the new plants had the necessary fungal networks to thrive in the harsh environment. The synergy between the atmospheric and terrestrial teams was flawless, a dance of science and passion that played out across the face of the planet. Sunder felt a deep connection to the land they were transforming, a sense of kinship with the tiny sprouts that were fighting their way toward the suns. Vespera visited the lab toward the end of the week, bringing with her a sample of the first insects to be introduced to the new savanna. They were small, sapphire-winged pollinators, engineered to be resilient to the fluctuating winds of the plains. She and Sunder spent the afternoon discussing the best release points for the insects, ensuring they would have access to the first blooming flowers of the gold grass. Vespera's enthusiasm was infectious, and she spoke of a future where the savanna would be home to massive herds of migratory grazers, their movements creating a grand, rhythmic cycle of nutrient distribution. Sunder could see it clearly in their mind's eye, a world that was not just a collection of isolated habitats, but a single, integrated masterpiece of biological engineering. They were the conductors of an immense orchestra, and every instrument was starting to play in harmony. The optimism that fueled their work was not a shield against the world, but an engagement with it, a belief that beauty and balance were the natural state of the universe if only given the chance to flourish. As the first month of the Savanna project drew to a close, the change in the landscape was nothing short of miraculous. The dust plains had vanished, replaced by a swaying sea of grass that rippled in the wind like the waves of the northern ocean. Small clusters of hardy, wide-canopied trees were beginning to take root along the new riverbeds that had formed from the runoff of the Great Spine. The air over the plains was now cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of damp earth and new growth. Sunder took a final flight over the area before returning to the primary meridian, looking down at the transformation with a sense of profound humility. They had provided the spark, but the planet had provided the flame. The resilience of life was a constant source of wonder, a reminder that their role was as much about listening as it was about acting. Parnassia was a partner in this endeavor, a living entity that responded to their care with an outpouring of abundance. Back in the city, the preparations for the Centennial Festival were reaching their peak. The streets were filled with the sights and sounds of a society in celebration. Gigantic, translucent banners hung from the spires, catching the light and casting shifting patterns of color onto the crowds below. There was a palpable sense of joy in the air, a shared pride in the achievements of the last 100 years. Sunder found themselves in high demand, as the success of the Savanna project had become a focal point of the festival's narrative. They were asked to give presentations at the various learning centers, explaining the science behind the rain front and the future goals for the new biome. Sunder spoke with a quiet confidence, emphasizing the collaborative nature of the work and the importance of the Verdant Algorithm in maintaining the balance. They were greeted with genuine curiosity and warmth, a reminder that in this society, the pursuit of knowledge was a communal celebration. One evening, after a particularly long day of briefings, Sunder found themselves in the central arboretum, seeking the solace of the weeping willow moss. The nectar birds were still there, their numbers increasing as the floral abundance of the city reached its zenith. Sunder sat on the same bench as before, letting the cool, mint-scented air wash over them. They thought about the journey they had taken from the crystalline reefs of the north to the shimmering rains of the savanna. It was a journey of expansion, both of the planet's life and of their own understanding. They realized that the true power of the Accord was not in its technology or its laws, but in its ability to foster a deep, emotional connection between the people and their world. They were not just residents of Parnassia, they were its guardians, its lovers, and its children. The optimism that defined them was a choice they made every day, a commitment to seeing the potential in every seed and every storm. Vespera joined them after a while, sitting quietly in the twilight. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the bioluminescent lilies begin to glow in response to their presence. The flowers turned a soft, pulsing shade of amber, reflecting a sense of contentment and peace. Vespera finally spoke, her voice a low murmur that blended with the rustle of the leaves. She talked about the next phase of the Savannah project, the introduction of the large-scale grazers and the predators that would keep their populations in check. It was the next step in the creation of a truly self-regulating ecosystem, a complex web of life that would require even more precise management and a deeper level of trust in the natural processes. Sunder listened, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The work was never done, and that was the beauty of it. There was always another horizon to reach, another mystery to solve, another garden to tend. As the twin suns set and the indigo night took hold, Sunder and Vespera walked together through the glowing streets of the Meridian. They talked about the future, not as a distant, abstract concept, but as something they were building with their own hands. They imagined the savannah in another 100 years, with forests that reached the clouds and rivers that teemed with life. They imagined the accord spreading to other worlds, bringing the same philosophy of harmony and growth to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. It was a grand vision, but on a night like this, surrounded by the evidence of their success, it felt entirely possible. The Verdant Algorithm was humming in the foundations of the city, a silent partner in their dreams. Sunder looked up at the stars, seeing them not as cold, distant lights, but as seeds waiting to be planted. The universe was a vast, fertile field, and they were just beginning to learn how to farm it. The final night before the festival was a time of quiet preparation for everyone in the primary meridian. Sunder spent it in their quarters, reviewing the final details of the reef and savannah data for the Grand Archive. They felt a sense of completion, a closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The logs were full of technical details, but between the lines, they told a story of passion, dedication, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of their mission. Sunder recorded a final entry for the century, a message to those who would follow in their footsteps. They spoke of the importance of patience, the necessity of humility, and the profound joy that came from being a part of a living world. They closed the slate and stood by the window, watching the lights of the city merge with the glow of the forest. The world was ready for the celebration, and so was Sunder. The morning of the centennial arrived with a burst of color and light. The entire population of the primary meridian gathered in the central hub, a sea of faces illuminated by the morning suns. There were no speeches from politicians, no displays of military might. Instead, there was a collective moment of silence, a shared recognition of the world they had built together. Then, the planting began. Thousands of people, from the youngest children to the oldest elders, took up small, biodegradable pots containing the seeds of the new lilies Vespera had developed. They moved out into the city and the surrounding forests, placing the seeds in the earth with a sense of ritual and reverence. Sunder and Vespera planted theirs together at the base of the Great Spine, at the edge of the new savannah. As the seeds touched the soil, the bioluminescent lilies began to glow, 1,000 tiny lights spreading across the landscape like a reflection of the stars above. It was a beautiful, symbolic gesture, a promise to keep growing, to keep tending, and to keep dreaming. As the festival continued into the night, the primary meridian was transformed into a wonderland of light and sound. The shimmering rain from the Savannah project had left a fine, crystalline coating on the buildings, which now sparkled in the glow of the lilies. There was dancing in the streets, and the air was filled with the scent of 1,000 different flowers. Sunder stood on a balcony overlooking the hub, watching the celebration with a full heart. They saw Orin and Marlowe in the crowd, sharing a laugh and a drink, their different worlds united by a common purpose. They saw the children playing among the glowing vines, their laughter a testament to the safety and abundance of their world. In this moment, the optimism of Parnassia was not just a philosophy, it was a living, breathing reality. The Verdant Algorithm had provided the framework, but the people had provided the soul. Sunder looked out toward the horizon, where the new savannah lay under the indigo sky. They knew that the work would continue tomorrow, that there would be new challenges to face and new systems to calibrate. But for tonight, they allowed themselves to simply be a part of the world they had helped to create. They felt the cool breeze on their face, the scent of mint and rain in the air, and the steady beat of their own heart. The universe was wide and full of wonder, and they were a part of it, a tiny, essential piece of a grand and beautiful design. The story of Parnassia was a story of life in all its complexity and glory, and as Sunder turned back toward the celebration, they knew that the best was yet to come. The first century was just the beginning, a foundation upon which they would build a future that was limited only by their imagination. The stars were waiting, and the garden was in bloom. The festival concluded with a final, massive release of the sapphire-winged pollinators, thousands of them rising into the air like a cloud of blue sparks. They drifted over the city and out toward the savannah, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of an entire civilization. Sunder watched them go, a smile touching their lips. The cycle was complete, and yet it was starting all over again. They felt a sense of profound peace, a certainty that whatever came next, they were ready. The Verdant Algorithm hummed a steady, reassuring note in the background of their mind, a reminder that they were never truly alone. They were a part of the Accord, a part of Parnassia, and a part of the eternal, upward reach of life itself. And with that thought, Sunder stepped back into the light of the festival, ready to dance, to laugh, and to dream of the next 100 years. The conclusion of the centennial did not bring a period of stagnation or a lull in the collective momentum of Parnassia, but rather a focused redirection of energy toward the orbital frontier. Analyst Sunder found themselves reassigned from the terrestrial zones to the high-orbit synchronous station, a glittering ring of solar collectors and botanical laboratories that served as the primary gateway between the planet and the stars beyond. The transition required a physical recalibration. The gravity here was a crisp 90% of the planetary standard, giving Sunder a sense of buoyancy that matched the heightened ambitions of the new century. The mission was the implementation of the Atmospheric Extension Project, an initiative designed to weave a thin, protective membrane of ionized particles and synthetic microbes into the upper thermosphere. This would not only further stabilize the weather patterns Sunder had helped establish on the surface, but would also act as a living filter for solar radiation, allowing for more delicate forms of high-altitude agriculture. Sunder stood at the observation portal of the station, looking down at the world they had spent years nurturing. From this height, the Great Spine was a jagged emerald ridge, and the new savannah was a sprawling carpet of gold that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the tides. The lead researcher on the station was a woman named Thalia, whose specialized field was the synthesis of vacuum-hardy flora. Thalia did not possess the weathered exterior of Marlowe or the quiet intensity of Orin. Instead, she moved with a fluid, almost ethereal grace, her mind always seemingly half-occupied by the complex geometries of molecular bonding. She greeted Sunder in the central hydroponics bay, where rows of translucent tubes spiraled toward the ceiling, filled with a neon blue nutrient solution. Inside the tubes, clusters of silver-leafed succulents were being conditioned for the extreme temperature fluctuations of the orbital environment. Thalia explained that these plants were the key to the atmospheric extension. They were engineered to exhume a specific variety of heavy oxygen isotopes that would form the backbone of the new thermospheric membrane. Sunder marveled at the intricacy of the design, noting how the orbital systems were being mirrored to reflect the biological successes of the surface. It was a vertical integration of life that spanned from the deepest ocean trenches to the edge of the vacuum. Sunder and Thalia spent the first few weeks of the assignment synchronizing the station's output with the Verdant Algorithm's terrestrial nodes. It was a delicate balancing act. If the orbital membrane became too dense, it could inadvertently cool the planet and disrupt the growth of the ironwood groves. If it was too thin, the radiation would scorch the new savanna. They worked with high-resolution spectrographs, mapping the interaction of the solar winds with the planet's magnetic field. Sunder suggested utilizing the kinetic energy from the station's stabilization thrusters to power the ionization chambers, a move that would increase the project's efficiency by nearly 12%. Thalia integrated the suggestion into the master schematic, her fingers moving across the interface like a weaver at a loom. There was a sense of profound harmony in their work, a shared belief that the limits of the environment were not barriers to be broken, but boundaries to be gracefully expanded through the application of wisdom and empathy. One afternoon, while monitoring the first release of the ionized isotopes, Sunder noticed a peculiar fluctuation in the data coming from the northern reefs. It appeared that the crystalline structures were emitting a low-frequency resonance that was being picked up by the station's sensitive atmospheric sensors. After a quick consultation with the maritime logs Marlowe had provided, Sunder realized that the reefs were not just processing minerals, they were communicating. The growth patterns of the crystals were shifting in response to the changes in the upper atmosphere, creating a feedback loop between the ocean floor and the edge of space. Sunder shared this discovery with Thalia, who was visibly moved by the implication. It meant that the planetary organism was becoming more self-aware, more interconnected than they had ever dared to dream. The Verdant algorithm began to adjust its parameters in real time, incorporating this new resonance into its global management strategy. It was no longer a machine managing a garden. It was a consciousness facilitating a conversation. The work on the atmospheric extension proceeded with a newfound sense of reverence. Sunder and Thalia began to treat the deployment of the isotopes as a form of poetry, carefully timing the releases to coincide with the planet's natural respiratory cycles. They watched as the first faint shimmering of the membrane began to appear, a veil of iridescent light that danced across the night side of the planet like a permanent, controlled aurora. This veil, which they called the Halcyon layer, began to hum at the same frequency as the northern reefs, creating a planetary harmony that could be felt as a subtle, soothing vibration in the bones of everyone on the station. Sunder felt a deep sense of peace, a realization that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of world, one where the distinction between technology and biology had finally, and perhaps permanently, dissolved into a singular, thriving entity. As the Halcyon layer stabilized, the benefits to the surface were immediate. The reports from Vespera indicated that the nectar birds were flying higher than ever before, their migratory paths expanding into the upper reaches of the Great Spine. The gold grass of the savanna was growing thicker, its roots digging deeper into the enriched soil as the softened sunlight provided the perfect conditions for photosynthesis. Sunder spent their off hours in the station's observation lounge, watching the play of light on the world below. They thought about the billions of lives being lived in the shade of the trees they had helped plant, and the millions of creatures that now called the new biomes home. The optimism that had fueled the first century of the Accord was being vindicated by every new leaf and every new wingbeat. It was a triumph of the spirit, a demonstration that a civilization could choose growth over extraction and love over dominion. Thalia approached Sunder during one of these quiet moments, carrying 2 canisters of chilled herbal tea. They sat together in silence for a while, watching a shuttle dock with the station's primary ring. Thalia eventually spoke about the next phase of the Accord's mission, the seeding of the neighboring moon, a barren, grey rock that had long served as a reminder of the universe's inherent emptiness. She proposed that the halcyon layer could be used as a bridge, a way to funnel surplus oxygen and moisture toward the moon through a controlled plasma conduit. It was a project of staggering scale, something that would take another century to complete, but the foundation was already there. Sunder felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect. The idea of turning a dead moon into a living sister world was the ultimate expression of the Parnassian philosophy. They were not just gardeners of a planet, they were becoming gardeners of a solar system. The planning for the lunar bridge began in earnest. Sunder took charge of the logistics, calculating the necessary gravitational trajectories and the energy requirements for the plasma conduit. They worked closely with the orbital engineering teams, who were already designing the massive focusing lenses that would be required to direct the flow of life-giving gases. It was a project that required the cooperation of every soul on Parnassia and the Synchronous station. The resources of the northern reefs would provide the crystalline materials for the lenses, and the labor would be shared by everyone in a grand, communal effort. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The success of the last century had given the people a bone-deep confidence in their ability to shape the future. Sunder saw this reflected in every message, every data transfer, and every face they encountered on the station. They were a people who had forgotten how to fear the unknown, replaced instead by a voracious, joyful curiosity. In the midst of the planning, Sunder took a short leave to visit the surface, wanting to feel the earth beneath their feet before the lunar bridge project consumed their life. They landed in the heart of the primary meridian and were immediately struck by the change in the atmosphere. The air felt richer, more vibrant, as if the halcyon layer was indeed breathing life back into the ground. Sunder visited the arboretum and found Vespera tending to a new grove of silver-leafed succulents, offspring of the ones Thalia had developed in orbit. The plants were thriving in the natural soil, their leaves shimmering with the same iridescent light as the thermospheric membrane. Vespera greeted Sunder with a warm embrace, and they spent the afternoon walking through the city, witnessing the ways in which the orbital work had transformed daily life. The people seemed more energized, their movements more purposeful, as if they could sense the grand scale of the new mission. Sunder also traveled to the southern hemisphere to see the results of the latest scrubber recalibrations. The air there was so pure it was almost intoxicating, filled with the scent of 1,000 different blooming species. They stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean, watching the waves crash against the shore. In the distance, the bioluminescent glow of the northern reefs was visible even in the daylight, a constant reminder of the planet's interconnectedness. Sunder felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path their life had taken. From a junior analyst to a key architect of the planetary future, every step had been guided by the same simple principle: to leave the world better than they found it. As they prepared to return to the synchronous station, Sunder took a handful of the rich, dark soil and let it sift through their fingers, a silent promise to the world that had given them everything. The return to orbit was marked by the commencement of the first plasma conduit test. Sunder stood at the control console of the station, watching as the focusing lenses aligned with the lunar target. The energy from the solar collectors began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the very frame of the station. Thalia gave the signal, and a beam of brilliant, emerald-green light shot out from the station, piercing the darkness of space and striking the surface of the moon. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, a bridge of pure energy carrying the breath of Parnassia to its silent neighbor. The Verdant Algorithm monitored the flow, ensuring that the pressure remained constant and the trajectory remained true. On the moon's surface, the first automated habitats were already waiting, ready to capture the incoming gases and begin the process of atmospheric thickening. The test was a resounding success. The data confirmed that the conduit was stable and that the lunar habitats were successfully storing the oxygen. It would be years before the moon was habitable and decades before the first forests would take root, but the first step had been taken. Sunder and Thalia celebrated with the rest of the station crew, a modest gathering filled with a sense of quiet, profound achievement. They knew that they might not live to see the moon turn green, but they were satisfied knowing that their work had made it inevitable. The legacy of the Accord was not in the things they completed, but in the processes they initiated. They were the architects of a future they would only partially inhabit, and that was enough. The optimism of Parnassia was a flame that was passed from hand to hand, growing brighter with every transition. As the night cycle began on the station, Sunder returned to the observation portal. The emerald beam of the plasma conduit was still visible, a thin, bright line connecting the two worlds. Below, the Halcyon layer continued its shimmering dance, and the northern reefs continued their silent song. Sunder felt a sense of unity with the universe that transcended words. They were part of a grand, cosmic gardening project, a collective effort to fill the void with life and light. The challenges of the past were lessons, the achievements of the present were foundations, and the possibilities of the future were infinite. Sunder closed their eyes, listening to the hum of the station and the distant resonance of the planet. They were a gardener of the stars, and the garden was growing beautifully. The final log entry for the orbital phase was a reflection on the nature of connection. Sunder wrote about the way the reefs talked to the sky, the way the forest breathed with the ocean, and the way the people of Parnassia worked as one. They wrote about the lunar bridge and the emerald light that carried hope through the vacuum. They wrote about Thalia and the silver-leafed succulents that were the pioneers of the new frontier. As they saved the data and prepared for the next day of work, Sunder felt a deep, abiding joy. The story of their world was no longer just about survival. It was about the exuberant, unstoppable expansion of life. The Verdant Algorithm was no longer a tool of management, but a partner in creation. Sunder stood tall, looking out at the stars, ready for whatever wonders the next chapter would bring. The universe was wide, and they had only just begun to plant. The silence of the lunar transition was not a void, but a canvas upon which the Accord began to paint with the colors of atmosphere and liquid water. Analyst Sunder had moved from the high-orbit synchronous station to the first permanent settlement on the lunar surface, a cluster of pressurized glass domes nestled within the shadows of the Shackleton crater. Here, the gravity was a mere sixth of the planetary norm, requiring a suite of metabolic stabilizers and a rhythmic, bounding gait that made every movement feel like an act of slow-motion gymnastics. The primary objective of the Lunar Reclamation Project was the activation of the great subsurface aquifers, massive pockets of ancient ice that had been identified by the first orbital probes. By using the energy from the emerald plasma conduit, which now pulsed steadily in the lunar sky like a tether of hope, Sunder and the engineering teams aimed to liquefy this ice and create the first standing bodies of water on a world that had known only dust for billions of years. Sunder stood at the edge of a deep excavation pit, watching the automated thermal drills bite into the regolith. The air inside the suit smelled of recycled minerals and the faint, sweet scent of the portable moss scrubbers that lined the helmet's interior. The director of the lunar operations was a woman named Zephyrine, a structural theorist who specialized in the architecture of low-gravity biomes. Zephyrine was a woman of immense patience, her skin the color of polished mahogany and her eyes always shielded by a thin layer of protective amber film. She greeted Sunder not with words, but by pointing toward the horizon, where the first of the massive focusing mirrors was unfolding its petals like a titanic, metallic sunflower. These mirrors caught the concentrated sunlight from the synchronous station and directed it down into the craters, creating localized pockets of warmth that allowed the first synthetic lichens to take hold on the rocks. Zephyrine explained that the goal was to create a self-sustaining microclimate within the next decade, a feat that would require the perfect synchronization of the water extraction cycles and the atmospheric thickening process. Sunder felt a familiar thrill of scale. They were no longer just tending a garden, they were awakening a corpse. Sunder and Zephyrine spent the following months living in the subterranean levels of the Shackleton base, where the thick layers of lunar soil provided natural protection from cosmic rays. The work was grueling, but deeply rewarding. Sunder's role was to interface the lunar sensors with the Verdant Algorithm back on Parnassia, ensuring that the planetary AI could provide the necessary processing power to model the complex thermodynamics of the melting ice. They discovered that the subsurface aquifers were not just composed of pure water, but were enriched with a variety of rare gases and minerals that, when released, would accelerate the formation of a breathable atmosphere. Sunder suggested a phased release of these gases, using the pressure of the expanding steam to drive the first generation of lunar wind turbines. Zephyrine integrated the plan into the primary construction schedule, noting that the kinetic energy would provide a crucial backup for the base's life support systems during the long lunar nights. As the first reservoirs began to fill with liquid water, the base took on a different character. The sound of trickling fluid, once a rarity, became a constant backdrop to their daily lives. Sunder watched through the reinforced viewports as the first blue pools formed in the base of the crater, their surfaces reflecting the brilliant green of the plasma conduit above. These were not just pools, they were the nurseries for the next generation of aquatic flora that Vespera was developing in the terrestrial labs. Sunder sent regular updates to Parnassia, sharing the data on the water's chemical composition and the stability of the local pressure zones. The response from the planet was one of overwhelming support. The success of the lunar project was seen as a collective victory for the entire Accord. Sunder felt the weight of that expectation, but it was a light burden, fueled by the visible progress of the world around them. One evening, while performing a routine check of the southern thermal drills, Sunder encountered a phenomenon that had not been predicted by the initial surveys. As the drills breached a particularly deep pocket of ice, the sensors began to pick up a series of rhythmic seismic vibrations that matched the frequency of the northern reefs on Parnassia. It appeared that the resonance Sunder had discovered in orbit was not limited to the planet's atmosphere, but was a fundamental property of the crystalline structures the Accord had seeded throughout the system. The lunar ice, under the influence of the emerald beam, was beginning to vibrate in sympathy with the mother world. Sunder realized that they were not just transferring matter and energy, they were extending the planetary consciousness itself. The moon was learning the song of Parnassia. Sunder sat in the silence of the rover, listening to the subtle thrumming in the floorboards, feeling a sense of connection that spanned the vacuum between the two spheres. The revelation of the sympathetic resonance changed the approach of the lunar teams. They began to treat the development of the moon not as a separate engineering project, but as a biological extension of the Parnassian ecosystem. Zephyrine started designing the new habitats to incorporate crystalline structural elements that would amplify the resonance, creating a more harmonious environment for the human and synthetic inhabitants. Sunder worked with the Verdant Algorithm to refine the frequency of the plasma conduit, turning it into a carrier wave for the complex biological instructions that would guide the growth of the first lunar forests. The transition was seamless. The technology was no longer an intruder on the lunar landscape, but a catalyst for its transformation. Sunder felt a deep pride in this evolution, seeing it as the ultimate realization of the Parnassian philosophy. They were creating a symphony of life, and the moon was the newest instrument in the orchestra. As the first year of the lunar project drew to a close, the change in the Shackleton crater was nothing short of miraculous. The dust plains of the crater floor were now covered in a thick carpet of bioluminescent moss, which glowed with a soft, pulsing light that mimicked the rhythms of the Parnassian tides. The blue pools had expanded into a small network of interconnected lakes, teeming with the first generation of lunar-adapted plankton. The air within the domes was now rich and fragrant, oxygenated by the vast walls of ivy that climbed the interior supports. Sunder took a moment to walk through the first lunar grove, a small cluster of genetically modified trees that had been designed to grow in low gravity. The trees were tall and slender, their branches reaching upward in elegant, spiraling patterns that seemed to defy the very concept of weight. Sunder touched the smooth, silver bark of a sapling, feeling the faint vibration of the planet's song pulsing within its fibers. Zephyrine joined Sunder in the grove, her amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of the moss. She talked about the next phase of the expansion, the construction of the Great Dome, a massive structure that would cover the entire Shackleton crater and allow for the creation of a fully integrated, open-air ecosystem. It was an ambitious plan, one that would require the fabrication of thousands of tons of transparent ceramic, all harvested from the lunar regolith and the minerals processed by the northern reefs. Sunder looked up at the stars, which were now partially obscured by the thickening lunar atmosphere. They could see the synchronous station, a bright point of light in the blackness, and the emerald beam of the conduit that connected them to home. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was a physical reality they were building with every breath and every breakthrough. The planning for the Great Dome brought Sunder into contact with a new group of specialists, the lunar architects. These were men and women who had grown up in the era of the Accord, individuals who saw no distinction between the built environment and the natural world. They worked with Sunder to integrate the sensor networks directly into the structural framework of the dome, creating a living shell that would respond to the needs of the inhabitants in real time. If the oxygen levels dropped in one sector, the shell would stimulate the growth of the nearby ivy. If the temperature rose, it would adjust the transparency of the ceramic panels to provide more shade. It was a level of integration that had never been achieved before, a testament to the power of the sympathetic resonance and the wisdom of the Verdant Algorithm. Sunder found themselves in a constant state of wonder, inspired by the creativity and the passion of the people around them. Despite the successes, the lunar environment remained a formidable challenge. There were occasional moonquakes as the crust adjusted to the thermal changes, and the long lunar nights required a careful management of the energy reserves. Sunder spent many hours in the control room, monitoring the stability of the plasma conduit and the integrity of the pressure seals. There was no room for error, but there was also no room for fear. The culture of Parnassia was built on the foundation of collective responsibility and mutual trust. If a problem arose, it was solved through collaboration and the application of logic, never through blame or competition. Sunder felt a deep sense of security in this community, knowing that they were all working toward the same goal, the flourishing of life in all its forms. One of the most profound moments of the lunar project occurred when the first lunar rain was recorded. As the atmospheric pressure reached a critical threshold, the moisture from the blue pools began to condense in the upper reaches of the domes. Sunder was standing in the central plaza when the first drops began to fall, small, slow-moving spheres of water that drifted through the air like liquid diamonds. Because of the low gravity, the rain did not fall so much as it floated, creating a shimmering mist that hung in the air and caught the light from the bioluminescent moss. The people of the base stopped what they were doing, stepping out into the plaza to experience the miracle. Sunder felt the cool touch of the water on their skin, a sensation that was both familiar and entirely new. It was a baptism for the new world, a sign that the moon was no longer a dead rock, but a living, breathing entity. The success of the lunar rain prompted a celebration that lasted for 3 lunar days. There were feasts, storytelling sessions, and a grand communal planting of the first fruit-bearing trees. Sunder and Zephyrine planted a grove of sun apples, a hardy variety that had been engineered to thrive in the filtered light of the domes. As they tucked the roots into the enriched lunar soil, Sunder felt a sense of closure. Their time on the moon was coming to an end, as the project was now stable enough to be managed by the local teams. Sunder had been called back to Parnassia to assist with the next phase of the Accord's grand design, the Deep Space Seeding Initiative. It was a bittersweet moment. They had grown to love the stark beauty of the moon and the quiet resilience of its people. But they also knew that their work was part of a larger cycle, a continuous journey toward the stars. On their final night at the Shackleton base, Sunder sat by the edge of the largest lake, watching the reflection of the Parnassian suns in the still water. The emerald beam of the plasma conduit was a constant presence, a reminder of the link that could never be broken. Sunder thought about the journey they had taken, from the emerald forests of the mother world to the silver plains of the moon. They had seen the power of life to transform the most hostile environments, and the power of the human spirit to guide that transformation with wisdom and care. They felt a profound sense of gratitude for the opportunity to have played a part in this story, to have been a witness to the birth of a new world. The optimism that had fueled their work was now a tangible reality, a shimmering, living world that stood as a testament to the possibilities of the future. Zephyrine joined Sunder for a final farewell, presenting them with a small, crystalline pendant carved from a piece of the first lunar reef. It was a symbol of the sympathetic resonance, a reminder of the connection that spanned the vacuum. They shared a quiet moment of reflection, acknowledging the bond that had formed between them during the long months of work. Zephyrine spoke of the future of the moon, of the cities that would one day sprawl across its surface and the forests that would fill its craters. She thanked Sunder for their contribution, noting that the success of the project would not have been possible without their insight and dedication. Sunder felt a surge of emotion, a deep sense of belonging that transcended time and space. They were a part of the Accord, and the Accord was a part of them. As the shuttle carried Sunder away from the moon and back toward Parnassia, They looked down at the Shackleton crater one last time. From this height, the Great Dome was a glittering jewel in the darkness, a beacon of life in the lunar wasteland. They could see the faint green glow of the moss and the shimmering reflection of the blue pools. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of what could be achieved when a civilization chose to work in harmony with the universe. Sunder turned their gaze toward the stars, which were now more vibrant and full of potential than ever before. The Deep Space Seeding Initiative was the next step, a journey into the unknown that would carry the seeds of the Accord to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Sunder felt a sense of excitement and wonder, a readiness for the challenges and the discoveries that lay ahead. The final log entry for the lunar phase was a message of hope and a call to action. Sunder wrote about the lunar rain, the sympathetic resonance, and the power of life to overcome the silence of the void. They wrote about the importance of connection, both between worlds and between people. They wrote about the future, a future where every world was a garden and every star was a sun for a thriving civilization. As they saved the data and watched the moon recede into the distance, Sunder felt a deep, abiding peace. The story of Parnassia was a story of growth, and that growth was now reaching out to touch the entire solar system. The Verdant Algorithm hummed a steady, reassuring note in the background of their mind, a reminder that they were never truly alone. They were a gardener of the stars, and the universe was waiting to be planted. The journey back to Parnassia was a time for reflection and preparation. Sunder spent their hours in the shuttle's observation lounge, watching the transition from the stark blackness of space to the vibrant colors of the planetary atmosphere. They thought about the people they had met, the challenges they had overcome, and the lessons they had learned. They felt a sense of renewal, a strengthening of their commitment to the Parnassian philosophy. The success of the lunar project had proved that the Accord's vision was not limited to a single world, but was a universal principle that could be applied to any environment. Sunder was ready for the next phase, ready to carry the message of harmony and growth to the stars. The universe was wide and full of wonder, and they were just beginning to learn how to live within it. Upon landing at the primary meridian, Sunder was greeted by a world that had continued to evolve in their absence. The city was even more integrated with the forest, the buildings almost indistinguishable from the massive trees that supported them. The air was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the sound of the nectar birds. Sunder felt a profound sense of homecoming, a realization that Parnassia would always be their anchor, no matter how far they traveled. They were met by Vespera and Orin, who were eager to hear about the success of the lunar project. They spent the evening sharing stories and discussing the future, a reminder of the enduring strength of the Parnassian community. The story of their world was a story of connection, and that connection was stronger than ever. The final night of their return was spent in the central arboretum, sitting beneath the same willow moss tree where they had found solace so many years ago. The world was quiet, but it was a vibrant, living quiet. The northern reefs were singing, the halcyon layer was shimmering, and the lunar moon was glowing with its new life. Sunder felt a deep sense of peace, a certainty that they were a part of something grand and beautiful. The future was a vast, open horizon, and they were ready to meet it with open arms and a curious mind. The journey of the Accord was just beginning, and every day was a new chapter in a story of growth, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. Sunder closed their eyes, letting the scent of the mint and the sweet humidity carry them into a restful sleep, ready to face the next great adventure. The transition from the silver intimacy of the lunar domes to the staggering scale of the Deep Space Seeding Initiative required a fundamental shift in Analyst Sunder's perception of distance. While Parnassia and its moon were partners in a localized dance, the new mission involved the Uit cloud harvesters, massive, semi-organic vessels designed to dwell in the freezing outskirts of the solar system. These ships were not built in traditional dry docks, but were grown from the same biocrystalline structures that formed the northern reefs, accelerated by high-energy nutrient baths and guided by the harmonic frequencies of the Verdant Algorithm. Sunder arrived at the primary harvester, a vessel named the Aurelian Bloom, which spanned several kilometers in length and possessed a hull that shimmered with a deep, iridescent violet. The interior of the Aurelian Bloom was a labyrinth of pressurized parklands and laboratory clusters, where the centrifugal force of the ship's rotation provided a comfortable simulated gravity. Here, the mission was to intercept long-period comets and seed them with specialized microbial packages, turning these wandering ice balls into mobile life support pods that would eventually drift toward neighboring star systems. The commander of the Aurelian Bloom was an individual named Kestrel, a veteran of the early atmospheric trials who had spent more time in the weightless silence of the outer rim than on the surface of Parnassia. Kestrel was lean and moved with a predatory efficiency, though their temperament was one of profound serenity. They met Sunder in the Forward Observation Arboretum, a glass-domed forest at the prow of the ship that looked out into the infinite black. Kestrel explained that the comets were the perfect vessels for the Accord's message. They were composed of the raw materials of life, water, ammonia, and organic compounds, and their long trajectories provided the necessary time for the bioengineered seeds to gestate. The goal was to create a network of waystation comets that would serve as stepping stones for the next generation of interstellar explorers. Sunder looked at the distant, icy specks through the ship's telescopic arrays, feeling a sense of awe at the audacity of the plan. They were no longer just gardening a world or a moon. They were sowing the vacuum itself. Sunder's specific task was the calibration of the seeding harpoons, kinetic delivery systems that would fire the microbial payloads into the heart of the passing comets. These payloads were masterpieces of biological compression, containing dormant fungal networks, hardy moss spores, and a miniaturized version of the crystalline resonance emitters. Sunder worked in the ship's engineering sublevels, where the hum of the fusion reactors provided a steady, reassuring vibration. They collaborated with a synthetic intelligence named Ian, a specialized node of the Verdant Algorithm that had been partitioned to manage the harvester's complex navigation. Together, they calculated the precise impact velocities required to bury the seeds deep within the comet's icy mantle without destroying the delicate biological structures. Sunder found the work to be a perfect blend of high-energy physics and sensitive horticulture, a testament to the interdisciplinary nature of the Accord's progress. During the first encounter with a target comet, a massive shard of ice designated C209, Sunder felt a tension they hadn't experienced since the early days of the Savannah project. The Aurelian Bloom drew alongside the comet, its violet hull glowing as it reflected the faint light of the distant suns. The harpoons were primed, their emerald-tipped projectiles gleaming in the launch tubes. Sunder monitored the telemetry, watching the distance close with agonizing slowness. At the moment of peak alignment, Kestrel gave the order, and the projectiles leaped across the void, trailing thin lines of silver filament. The impact was silent but visually spectacular. The ice of the comet blossomed into a cloud of crystalline vapor as the seeds were deposited. Sunder watched the sensors as the fungal networks began to take hold, using the heat of the impact to jumpstart their metabolism. Within hours, the comet began to emit the familiar low-frequency hum of the Parnassian resonance. It was no longer a cold rock, it was a beacon. The success of the first seeding sparked a period of intense activity aboard the Aurelian Bloom. Over the next several months, Sunder and the crew intercepted dozens of comets, turning a significant portion of the local Oort cloud into a shimmering field of potential life. They developed a rhythm to the work, a dance of approach, impact, and monitoring that became the heartbeat of the ship. Sunder spent much of their time in the labs, refining the microbial payloads to suit the varying chemical compositions of the comets. They discovered that some comets were rich in silicates, requiring a different strain of lichen than those composed primarily of water ice. Sunder's ability to adapt the biological parameters on the fly became a critical asset to the mission. They felt a deep sense of connection to these wandering seeds, imagining them drifting through the interstellar dark for thousands of years before finally finding a new home to awaken. As the Aurelian Bloom pushed further into the outer reaches of the system, the sense of isolation from Parnassia grew, but so did the strength of the internal community. The crew lived in a state of perpetual collaboration, their daily lives intertwined with the health of the ship's onboard ecosystems. Sunder became close friends with Kestrel, often spending the ship's night cycles in the observation arboretum, discussing the long-term implications of their work. Kestrel spoke of a future where the entire galaxy was linked by these comet paths, a web of life that would ensure the survival of the Accord's ideals even if the mother world should fall. Sunder found comfort in this cosmic perspective, a realization that they were contributing to a legacy that was truly eternal. The optimism of Parnassia was not a localized phenomenon. It was a universal constant that they were helping to broadcast. One of the most significant breakthroughs occurred when Ian, the ship's synthetic partner, identified a way to use the comet's own outgassing to steer their trajectories. By strategically placing thermal vents, small biocrystalline structures that concentrated sunlight, the seeds could control the release of water vapor, effectively turning the comets into low-thrust spacecraft. This meant that the waystation comets could be directed towards specific star systems with a high probability of having habitable planets. Sunder and the engineering team worked tirelessly to integrate this biological navigation into the seeding packages. It was the ultimate refinement of the Accord's philosophy, giving life the tools to seek its own destination. Sunder felt a profound sense of humility as they watched the first steerable comet alter its course, a tiny speck of light carving a path through the darkness with intentionality. The mission was not without its hazards. On one occasion, the Aurelian Bloom encountered a dense field of micrometeoroids that threatened to breach the ship's forward shields. Sunder had to work alongside the maintenance drones, using localized gravity pulses to deflect the debris while ensuring the integrity of the Arboretum's glass dome. The experience was a reminder of the fragility of their existence in the deep dark, but it also highlighted the resilience of their technology. The ship's hull, being organic in nature, began to heal itself almost immediately, the violet ceramic flowing over the small pits and scars like scar tissue. Sunder felt a surge of affection for the Aurelian Bloom. It was more than a vessel, it was a companion, a living piece of Parnassia that carried them through the void. The bond between the crew and the ship was absolute, a synergy of flesh, crystal, and code. As the 3-year mission drew toward its conclusion, the Oort cloud had been transformed. Thousands of comets now hummed with the resonance of the Accord, their surfaces beginning to show the first tints of green as the hardy mosses thrived in the thin sunlight. These comets were the advance guard of a new era, the first ripples of a wave of life that would eventually wash over the neighboring stars. Sunder prepared the final reports for the Council of Architects, documenting the success of the biological navigation and the stability of the microbial gestations. They felt a sense of profound accomplishment, a knowledge that they had pushed the boundaries of the possible. The Deep Space Seeding Initiative had turned the outer rim from a barrier into a gateway, a bridge of ice and hope that stretched into the infinite. The final days aboard the Aurelian Bloom were spent in a state of quiet reflection. Sunder visited every corner of the ship, from the thrumming reactor cores to the silent, starlit reaches of the Arboretum. They felt a deep sense of gratitude for Kestrel, Ian, and the rest of the crew, whose dedication had made the mission a success. On the final evening, before the return burn toward Parnassia, the crew gathered in the observation dome for a communal meal. There were no speeches, only a shared look at the vast field of seeded comets they were leaving behind. Sunder saw the beauty in the darkness, a beauty that was now enhanced by the presence of life. They realized that the universe was not a cold, empty place, but a fertile ground waiting for the right gardener. The optimism that had guided them was no longer a hope. It was a proven reality, etched into the ice of the stars. The return journey was a time for Sunder to process the immense scale of what they had witnessed. They spent hours reviewing the data slates, watching the trajectories of the seeded comets as they began their long journeys into the deep. Each comet was a promise, a letter sent to the future. Sunder thought about the generations of explorers who would follow these paths, finding shelter and sustenance in the way stations they had created. They felt a sense of connection to these future people, a bond of shared purpose that spanned the centuries. The Accord was not just a society of the present, it was a movement of the future, a continuous unfolding of potential that would never truly end. Sunder felt a deep, abiding peace, a certainty that they were a part of something that mattered. Upon entering the inner system, the Aurelian Bloom was met by a fleet of smaller tenders, which brought fresh supplies and the latest news from the surface. Sunder learned that the lunar Great Dome was nearing completion and that the first forests were already thriving in the Shackleton crater. The Halcyon layer had been expanded, and the northern reefs were now processing enough minerals to begin the construction of a second synchronous station. The progress on Parnassia was accelerating, fueled by the success of the orbital and lunar projects. Sunder felt a surge of joy at the news. The world they had helped build was flourishing in ways they could hardly have imagined. They were eager to return to the surface, to smell the mint and the sweet humidity of the primary meridian once more. The docking of the Aurelian Bloom at the synchronous station was a moment of grand ceremony. Sunder and the crew were greeted as heroes, though they felt more like weary gardeners returning from a long season in the fields. They were transferred to a planetary shuttle, which carried them down through the iridescent veil of the Halcyon layer. As the shuttle broke through the cloud deck, Sunder saw the familiar emerald sprawl of the forests and the golden shimmer of the savannah. The world looked more vibrant than ever, a masterpiece of biological engineering and natural beauty. Sunder felt the thickness of the air as they landed, the rich, oxygen-heavy breath of a planet in its prime. It was good to be home, but Sunder knew that home was now a much larger concept than it had been when they first started. Sunder's return to the primary meridian was marked by a reunion with Vespera, who had spent the last 3 years refining the genetic diversity of the terrestrial biomes. They met in the central arboretum, which had grown even more lush and complex in Sunder's absence. Vespera listened with wide eyes as Sunder described the seeding of the comets and the biological navigation of the ice shards. They talked late into the night, their voices blending with the rustle of the leaves and the distant hum of the reefs. Vespera showed Sunder the latest strain of bioluminescent lilies, which now glowed with a deep, pulsing violet that matched the hull of the Aurelian Bloom. It was a gesture of solidarity, a way of bringing the colors of the deep space down to the Earth. Sunder felt a profound sense of belonging, a realization that every part of their journey was connected. The final log entry for the deep space phase was a reflection on the nature of legacy. Sunder wrote about the comets and the silver filaments, the violet hull and the emerald harpoons. They wrote about Kestrel and the silent beauty of the Oort cloud. Most importantly, they wrote about the future, the way the seeds they had planted would one day wake up on distant worlds, carrying the spirit of the Accord to the ends of the galaxy. They closed the slate and stood on their balcony, looking up at the stars. The halcyon layer was shimmering above them, and the moon was glowing in the distance. Sunder felt a deep, abiding joy. The story of Parnassia was a story of life, and that life was now unstoppable. They were a gardener of the stars, and the garden was infinite. As Sunder prepared for their next assignment, the coordination of the first interstellar colony ship, they felt a sense of readiness that was both calm and energized. They had seen the beginning of the journey, and they were ready to see it through to the next horizon. The challenges would be great, but the resources of the Accord were greater. The Verdant Algorithm was humming a steady, reassuring note, a reminder that they were part of a grand and beautiful design. Sunder looked out over the glowing city, seeing the lights of the people and the lights of the forest merging into a single, vibrant tapestry. They were ready for the next chapter, ready to carry the seeds of hope to the very heart of the galaxy. The universe was wide, and the garden was just beginning to bloom. The final evolution of the Accord's vision did not manifest as a conquest of the physical universe, but as a deep, resonant integration of the biological and the stellar. Analyst Sunder, now a senior architect of the Interstellar Division, stood upon the embarkation platform of the Veridian Spire, the first true starship grown within the lunar Great Dome. Unlike the vessels of the Oort cloud, the Veridian Spire was a masterpiece of hyper-integrated materials. Its hull was a lattice of carbon-sequestering coral and superconducting sapphire, designed to transition through the folds of space-time by mimicking the quantum vibrations of the northern reefs. Sunder looked out across the interior of the Shackleton crater, which had been transformed into a lush, tropical valley where the air was scented with blooming orchids and the damp, rich musk of ancient ferns. The gravity stabilizers hummed a low, melodic frequency that resonated with the sympathetic resonance of the planet below. This ship was not merely a transport. It was a fragment of Parnassia herself, a living seed pod carrying a complete biosphere, 1,000 volunteers, and a direct neural link to the Verdant Algorithm. Sunder was joined on the platform by Vespera, who had been chosen as the lead biotic for the mission. Her hair was now shot through with silver, but her teal eyes remained as bright and inquisitive as the day they had first met in the primary meridian. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the final preparations as the migration birds of the lunar grove were ushered into the ship's internal aviaries. Vespera spoke of the target system, a triple-star cluster known as the Trinity Reach, where the preliminary comet probes had already begun the process of atmospheric priming. She described the potential for a world where the flora would thrive on the varying light spectrums of 3 different suns, creating a kaleidoscope of photosynthetic life that surpassed even the beauty of Parnassia. Sunder felt a profound sense of continuity. They were no longer just observers of a transformation, they were the catalysts for a galactic bloom. The optimism that had sustained them through the decades had matured into a quiet, unshakable certainty. The departure from the lunar surface was not marked by the roar of chemical engines or the violent displacement of atmosphere. Instead, the Veridian Spire began to glow with an intense, emerald radiance as it synchronized its internal resonance with the plasma conduit. Sunder felt a sensation of weightlessness that was followed by a sudden, exhilarating expansion of their consciousness. Through the neural link, they could feel the heartbeat of the ship, the respiration of the thousands of plants in the onboard gardens, and the collective anticipation of the crew. The moon receded behind them, a glittering jewel of glass and greenery, and then the stars began to stretch into long, shimmering ribbons of light. They were moving through the slipstream of the resonance, traveling along the very pathways of harmony they had spent their lives establishing. Sunder watched the telemetry as the distance between Parnassia and the Trinity Reach dissolved, the journey that would have taken centuries for the old empires now occurring in a span of solar weeks. During the transit, Sunder and Vespera worked to prepare the crew for the seeding of the new worlds. The Veridian Spire was a hive of activity, with every citizen contributing to the cultivation of the unique microbial packages designed for the Trinity environment. Sunder spent their time in the ship's core, interfacing with the partition node of the Verdant Algorithm to ensure the stability of the biocrystalline hull. They discovered that the ship was actually growing during the journey, its sapphire lattice expanding as it absorbed the stray cosmic radiation and converted it into structural matter. It was a perfect closed-loop system, a testament to the ultimate efficiency of the Accord's technology. Sunder felt a deep kinship with the ship, sensing its hunger for the light of new suns and its protective embrace of the life within. They were a single organism, a wandering forest, searching for a new clearing in the thicket of the stars. The arrival at the Trinity Reach was a moment of transcendent beauty. As the Veridian Spire emerged from the slipstream, the three suns, one a brilliant gold, one a soft rose, and one a piercing azure, illuminated the system in a display of color that defied description. Sunder stood in the observation gallery, watching as the ship approached the primary planet, a world of vast, empty oceans and rugged, iron-rich continents. The comet probes had done their work well. The atmosphere was already thick with the initial oxygen pulse, and the first rains were falling over the volcanic plains. Sunder gave the signal for the deployment of the global reefs, massive clusters of the crystalline spores that would stabilize the planetary crust and begin the mineral processing cycles. They watched as the spores descended like a fall of glowing snow, striking the dark waters and igniting a bioluminescent fire that spread from pole to pole. The colonization of the Trinity world, which they named Convergence, was the swiftest and most harmonious in the history of the Accord. Because the world had been primed by the resonance, the introduction of the terrestrial biomes was met with immediate success. Sunder and Vespera led the first landing parties, stepping out onto a shore of black sand where the waves were a shimmering violet. They planted the first ironwood grove in the shadow of a towering obsidian cliff, the trees immediately stretching their silver leaves toward the triple suns. Sunder felt the familiar taste of the air, crushed mint and sweet humidity, but with a new metallic edge that spoke of the world's untapped potential. They were not just repeating the success of Parnassia, they were creating something entirely new, a synthesis of the Accord's wisdom and the unique character of Convergence. As the years passed on Convergence, the planet transformed into a vibrant tapestry of life. The three suns created shifting seasons of color, with the forests turning from emerald to sapphire to crimson as the planetary orbit progressed. The cities of Convergence were built with the same principles as the primary meridian, but with a new emphasis on the verticality allowed by the planet's lower gravity. Sunder watched as the first generation of children born on Convergence grew up among the glowing vines and the singing reefs, their lives defined by a natural understanding of the planetary balance. The Verdant Algorithm, now a multi-node network spanning two systems, continued to provide the framework for growth. but the people were the heart of the evolution. Sunder felt a sense of completion as they walked through the central plaza of the new capital, seeing the unity of the two worlds reflected in every face and every flower. Sunder and Vespera eventually retired to a small villa overlooking the Great Convergence Reef, the largest crystalline structure ever grown. They spent their days tending to their personal garden, a collection of species from every world they had touched: the mint of Parnassia, the succulents of the high-orbit station, the mosses of the moon, and the iridescent lilies of the Aurelian bloom. They were the elders of a new civilization, a society that had moved beyond the need for conflict and scarcity, finding its purpose in the eternal work of stewardship. Sunder often sat by the shore at twilight, watching the three suns set in succession, casting long, colorful shadows over the water. They thought about the journey from a junior analyst to an architect of the stars, and they realized that every challenge had been a necessary step in the refinement of their spirit. The final transmission from the Parnassian Council arrived on the centennial of the Convergence landing. It was a message of celebration and a report on the next phase of the Accord's expansion. 5 more Viridian spires had been launched, each heading for a different sector of the galaxy, carrying the seeds of the Verdant Algorithm to new horizons. The network was growing, the resonance was spreading, and the universe was slowly but surely waking up. Sunder felt a surge of pride, a knowledge that the work they had started would continue long after they were gone. The optimism of the Accord was no longer just a philosophy of a single planet. It was the heartbeat of a growing interstellar community. They had proved that life, when guided by empathy and intelligence, was the most powerful force in the cosmos. On their final evening, Sunder sat with Vespera in the garden, the air filled with the scent of 1,000 different blooms. The sky was a deep indigo, and the halcyon layer of convergence was beginning to shimmer in response to the rising of the rose sun. Sunder opened their personal log one last time, looking back over the thousands of entries that documented their life's work. They didn't write about the technical details or the atmospheric constants. Instead, they wrote a single sentence, a testament to the journey and the future that awaited. They wrote about the beauty of a seed and the power of a dream. As they saved the entry and closed the slate, Sunder felt a profound, radiant peace. The story of their world was a story of hope, and that hope was now a part of the stars themselves. The Verdant Algorithm continued its silent, rhythmic humming in the background of the planetary network, a guardian of the balance and a partner in the growth. The forests of Parnassia, the domes of the moon, the ice of the comets, and the gardens of convergence were all linked in a grand, harmonious design. Sunder closed their eyes, listening to the song of the reefs and the rustle of the leaves, feeling the steady beat of their own heart in time with the universe. They were a gardener of the stars, and the garden was in full, glorious bloom. The journey was not an end, but a beginning, a constant unfolding of light and life that would reach the very edges of existence. And with that final thought, Sunder let go of the day, drifting into a restful sleep, confident in the beauty of the tomorrow they had helped to create.